In 18th century England, 1 in 3 children who contracted smallpox died, and those who survived were left with scars so severe they were often unrecognizable. This is the story of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, the aristocrat who brought variolation to England by experimenting on prisoners, orphans, and her own children. Welcome back to the lab, my curious test subjects. Today we are diving into one of history's most disturbing ethical progressions. A medical breakthrough that saved countless lives, but only after being tested on people who had absolutely no choice in the matter. Lady Montagu learned a dangerous procedure in Turkey, brought it back to England, and convinced the medical establishment to adopt it through a series of experiments that would make any modern ethics board physically ill. We are talking rusty needles, infectious pustules, imprisoned test subjects, and a final reveal involving royalty that perfectly captures how medicine has always worked. Experiment on the vulnerable, then protect the powerful. Strap in. This one gets dark fast. So what exactly did she learn in Turkey that was worth risking her own child's life? Variolation. The word comes from the Latin inoculare, meaning to graft. Think of variolation like an early vaccine. Except instead of a sterile lab, you had a rusty needle and someone else's infectious scabs. The process was simple and horrifying in equal measure. You took material from one person's smallpox pustules and scratched it into the skin of a healthy person, in 18th century medical terms. That means she let someone scratch pus from a sick person into her healthy child. The idea was that this would cause a milder case of smallpox and create immunity to the severe form that killed 1 in 3. Variolation had been practiced in parts of Africa and Asia for centuries. But Europeans had no idea it existed until Lady Montagu arrived in Turkey in 1718 as the wife of the English ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. She had survived smallpox herself, and her face was covered in disfiguring scars as a result. One story, popularized by Voltaire, claimed that the stunning beauty of harem women was due to inoculation. Circassian families inoculated their children to prevent scarring so they could sell them to wealthy men for better prices. Whether or not that story is true, Lady Montagu noticed that smallpox was far less deadly in Turkey than in England. She decided her 5-year-old son would be inoculated. A Turkish woman inoculated him awkwardly with a rusty needle, completely routine and not at all terrifying. Then the family's Scottish surgeon, Charles Maitland, inoculated him again in the other arm, just to be sure. First subject, her 5-year-old son. First method, 1 rusty needle, 2 inoculation attempts, 2 permanent scars. The Montagu family and Maitland returned to England in 1721, enthusiastic about variolation and determined to spread the practice. Now, you might be wondering, how do you convince an entire country to adopt a procedure involving infectious pustules and rusty needles? The answer, as always, is human experimentation. In 1721, Maitland inoculated Lady Montagu's 4-year-old daughter. She survived. But one aristocratic family's enthusiasm was not enough to change medical practice across an entire nation. So Maitland moved on to test subjects who could not say no. He inoculated 6 prisoners. In clinical trial terms, that means the subjects had absolutely no say in whether they participated. Spoiler, they did not consent. It was like a Phase 1 clinical trial, except the IRB was non-existent, and the test subjects were chosen because they had no power to refuse. All 6 prisoners survived, but survival was not enough. Maitland needed proof of immunity, so he took 1 prisoner, a woman, and deliberately exposed her to active smallpox. She proved immune. Now confident in the procedure, Maitland inoculated 10 orphaned children. Let us pause here to appreciate the pattern. When you want to test a dangerous medical procedure, you do not start with people who matter. You start with prisoners, then orphans, people society has already decided are expendable, people who cannot refuse, people whose deaths would be unfortunate, but not scandalous. And once you have confirmed that they survive, then, and only then, do you move up the social ladder. And here is where it gets really interesting. Who do you think got inoculated next? In 1722, Maitland inoculated 2 daughters of the Princess of Wales. After the prisoners and orphans survived, obviously. Read that progression again. Prisoners, orphans, princesses, in public health terms, that means they only trusted the procedure for royalty after it had been tested on people society considered expendable. Imagine a new medical treatment today being tested on inmates and foster kids before the FDA approved it for the president's daughters. That is exactly what happened. And it worked. The princesses survived. Variolation spread throughout England and then across Europe. Final count: prisoners, orphans, aristocratic children, and finally princesses. Variolation climbed the social ladder, one inoculation at a time. Now, here is the darkly funny part. This entire ethically horrifying progression actually saved lives. Variolation was a genuine medical breakthrough. It reduced smallpox mortality dramatically. It paved the way for Edward Jenner's safer cowpox vaccine decades later. It worked, but it only became widespread because Lady Montagu and Maitland were willing to experiment on people who had no power to refuse. The vulnerable were used to protect the powerful. And once the powerful were protected, the procedure became available to everyone. The breakthrough that saved millions of lives across Europe started with 6 prisoners, 10 orphans, and a rusty needle in Turkey. The ethics were appalling. The results were undeniable, and that uncomfortable tension between medical progress and human exploitation is the story of almost every major breakthrough in the history of medicine. Sometimes the right outcome comes from the wrong process, and we are still living with that reality today. And that is how smallpox inoculation came to England. 1 rusty needle, a dozen prisoners, 10 orphans, and 2 princesses later. Turns out the key to medical progress is testing on people who cannot say no, then giving it to people who can. At Science, Lady Montagu brought variolation to England because she had survived smallpox and refused to let her children suffer the same disfigurement. Her intentions were genuinely protective, but the path from personal conviction to widespread adoption required systematic experimentation on prisoners and orphans who had no choice in the matter. The procedure saved countless lives. It also exposed a truth about medical ethics that we still wrestle with today. Progress often comes at the expense of the vulnerable. Variolation worked. It spread across Europe. It eventually led to vaccination. And all it took was deciding that some lives were worth risking so that other lives could be saved. If you survived this story, curious test subjects, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments which historical experiment I should cover next. Until then, stay curious, stay skeptical, and maybe avoid rusty needles.